HMS Vanguard was a British fast battleship built during the Second World War and commissioned after the war ended. She was the largest and fastest of the Royal Navy's battleships, and the only one of her class. Vanguard was the last battleship to be built in history. Built at the famous John Brown shipyard, Clydebank, on the Clyde, Scotland. Work on Vanguard during the Second World War was started and stopped several times during the war. Her design was revised several times during her construction to reflect war experience. These stoppages and changes prevented her from being completed before the end of the war. Vanguard's first task after completing her sea trials at the end of 1946 was, early the next year, to convey King George VI and his family on the first royal tour of South Africa by a reigning monarch. While refitting her after her return, she was selected for another royal tour of Australia and New Zealand in 1948. This was cancelled due to King George's declining health, and Vanguard briefly became flagship of the Mediterranean Fleet in early 1949. After her return home in mid-1949, she became flagship of the Home Fleet Training Squadron. Throughout her career, the battleship usually served as the flagship of any unit for which she was assigned. During the early 1950s, Vanguard was involved in a number of training exercises with NATO forces. In 1953, she participated in Queen Elizabeth II's coronation review. While she was refitting in 1955, the Admiralty announced that the ship was going to be put in reserve upon completion of work. The same sort of things happen these days with cutbacks on military spending. Vanguard was sold for scrap and was broken up at the beginning of 1960 at Fastlane on the Clyde, Scotland, where the ship was built. The ship was significantly larger than her predecessors. The King George V class ships had been built with almost no shear at the main deck towards the front bow section to allow turret A to fire straight towards a zero elevation, resulting in no ships being wet forward. Vanguard was redesigned as a result of this experience, significant shear and flare being added to the bow. The ship's seaworthiness was well regarded, and the ship was able to keep an even keel in rough seas. As fleet flagship, Vanguard's complement was 115 officers and 1,860 men in 1947. Air conditioning was provided for many of the ship's control spaces, and asbestos insulation was provided in exposed areas of the ship's sides, decks and bulkheads. Steam heating was provided for her armament, instruments, lookout positions and other equipment to make Vanguard suitable for operations in the Arctic. The ship was launched on the 30th of November 1944 by Princess Elizabeth. Princess Elizabeth, the later Queen Elizabeth II, presided over this ceremony, the first ship she ever launched, and went on to launch many other ships. On the 9th of October 1959, the Admiralty announced that Vanguard would be scrapped and she was considered obsolete and too expensive to maintain. She was decommissioned on the 9th of June 1960 and sold to Biscoe for £560,000 on the 4th of August 1960, when the ship was scheduled to be towed from Portsmouth to the Breakers' Yard at Fastlane, Scotland. The whole of the South Sea seafront was packed with people who came to see her off. As Vanguard was being towed towards the harbour entrance, she slewed across the harbour and ran aground near the Still and West pub. She was pulled off by 5 tugboats an hour later, and after nearly running aground again near the Moving and East pub on the opposite shore, she made her final exit from Portsmouth. Clearly she didn't want to go. 5 days later she arrived at Fastlane, and by mid-1962 demolition process was complete. She was the last British battleship to be scrapped, the largest and fastest of them all, with improvements made following lessons learnt during World War II, sadly not to enter service until the end of war and have a relatively short life in service with the Royal Navy